Welcome. I'm Karen Chance Mercurius, the Director of Alumni Relations at Harvard Law School, and I'll be your host for today's session. Today, I'm delighted to welcome our featured speaker, Professor Susan Crawford. Susan Crawford is the John A. Riley Clinical Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and teaches courses about city uses of technology, internet law, and communications law. She served as Special Assistant to the President for Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy in 2009 and co-led the FCC transition team between the Bush and Obama administrations. She also served as a member of Mayor Michael Bloomberg's Advisory Council on Technology and Innovation and is now a member of Mayor Bill de Blasio's Broadband Task Force and San Francisco's Advisory Panel on Broadband. She is the author of Captive Audience, The Telecom Industry and Monopoly Power in the New Gilded Age, co-author of The Responsive City, Engaging Communities Through Data Smart Governance, and a contributor to Medium.com's Back Channel. All participants in today's HLeX open lecture will have the opportunity to submit questions. Please use the questions panel on your screen at any time during the presentation. We'll be addressing questions at the end of the presentation. Professor Crawford, welcome.
Thanks, Karen. It's a delight to be here. I'm a relatively new professor at Harvard Law School, and I'm so pleased at the opportunity to talk to all of you about what I believe is a profound issue for the United States, akin to the electrification challenge we faced 100 years ago. I'll be talking to you today about some broad topics. I'm going to start with myself, why I'm interested in Internet access, the future America won't have unless we install fiber optic cables everywhere, reaching every house and business in the country, and predictions for the next 4 years. I'll be talking for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have ample opportunity for questions. I became interested in this subject coming from a very quiet background. Both my parents were composers, and I grew up in an almost silent household. The ability of humans to connect has always been extremely interesting to me, initially through music and then later through the Internet. I was fortunate to be a young lawyer at Wilmer Cutler and Pickering in Washington, now WilmerHale, when the commercial Internet was first launched in the mid-90s. And the advent of the Internet was the biggest idea of my adult life, no question. The idea that anybody could connect with anybody else without asking permission is profoundly moving on a human level. My first website ever is from my hometown, Santa Monica, a beach house that opened up in the mid-90s called The Spot, where the very seductive text said, immerse yourself in the sun, sand, and secret journals of 5 20-somethings living under one roof. I distinctly remember clicking there to be able to talk to those people, and it was as if it was just like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You know, the coats went to each side, and I was able to look at something remote from myself. A remarkable and deeply profound experience, one that our 20-year-olds today can't really understand. Coming out of that experience as a partner at Wilmer Cutler, I became a board member of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. It's sort of jury duty for the Internet. I got to meet a lot of the engineers who were involved in the early protocols and ideas that shaped the Internet. Internationally became quite aware of what was going on. My own intellectual history since I left the firm at the end of 2002 has been quite steep. I thought that the telecom providers had really nothing to do with the Internet. The Internet I loved was a bunch of, hard scrabble people doing things on their own, had nothing to do with AT&T or then Bell Atlantic. As I began to learn about the role of Internet access providers in America, I understood their acronyms initially, sort of there's a lot of sheep from the goats in communications law. It took me a while to figure that out. I noticed there was a lot of merging going on. I then learned that there was no limit to their legal authority to discriminate when it comes to picking place to serve, what to charge, or what content to allow to flow over the Internet to Americans. I then became quite involved in the titanic battles over regulation and oversight of telecommunications companies over the last few years. And recently I've become extremely interested in the opportunities that the United States may be missing through inadequate government oversight leading to inadequate fiber access in this country. So that's where I've come from, some work in the White House. What I learned there was that federal funding, we called it the BTOP program, the Broadband Technologies Opportunities Program under the Obama administration, was leading to extremely successful products across the country and was focused on what are called middle mile projects. So here's a little graph of what I mean by middle mile. We have large capacity fiber optics, more on fiber optics in a moment, connecting cities in America, but then we needed to connect the anchor institutions in communities like colleges and libraries and schools. So a lot of that was done under the Obama administration, but only $4.2 billion was allocated for that. And it was enough to create a lot of points of light, but not actually move the needle on what's called last mile access in the United States. That is the bottleneck connection between businesses and homes and connection points on the internet. I also learned that where public investments or public oversight occurs, it has a tremendous multiplier effect in terms of creating spillovers in the forms of economic growth and social justice in communities. I learned that communities focusing on this needed to assess their needs and find partners, and I also learned that at the local level, Internet access is a thoroughly nonpartisan issue. It is something that every Republican and Democrat wants to see in their communities at a reasonable cost for health care, public safety, transportation, education, and our global competitiveness. But I then learned that it's extremely partisan at the federal level, which is where I was operating at the beginning of the Obama administration. This led me to write a book about the role of Comcast and Time Warner, the cable companies, in Internet access in the United States, about the fact that Verizon and AT&T had chosen to focus on wireless, so they'll take wireless, and Comcast and Time Warner chose to dominate wires, and they do in the United States. The name of the book is Captive Audience, as Karen kindly said, and it had, I think, an effect on the national dialogue for high-speed Internet access in America. The big picture, just so you know, is that when it comes to what the FCC currently defines as high-speed Internet access, which, by the way, is pretty slow, 25 megabits per second downstream and 33 megabits per second upstream. Upstream just means your ability to speak as well as listen. 20% of American homes don't have access to that kind of connection. They can't buy it at any price. And more than half of American homes have access to just one provider. We have a non-competitive and stagnant marketplace for high-speed Internet access. Nearly 75% of homes have no choice in providers, and the prices they're charging are unconstrained, and they have no particular incentive to provide us with better services. So that's a big picture on what we're paying for Internet access. We also know that we're leaving a lot of people behind. When it comes to lower income Americans, rural Americans, they're not necessarily adopting or using high-speed Internet access at the same rate as their richer urban counterparts. Affordability of high-speed Internet access is crucial. Why has this happened? Well, you can buy the book. You don't really have to. I'll explain it to you. What's happened is that a failure of policy in the United States. People are not adopting high-speed Internet access largely because it's too expensive. And it's too expensive because we haven't adopted ways of thinking about high-speed Internet access so far that would drive prices down and make it more widely available. Again, both for economic growth and social justice issues. It's particularly alarming in large, poorer urban cores where approaching 60% of people in Detroit don't have a wire at home. Same picture in Cleveland, 50%. The numbers are staggering and profoundly troubling in terms of entrenching and amplifying existing inequality in America. So I've mentioned fiber a few times, and you may be thinking, well, what's she talking about? There This is not a technical talk. There are only 3 wires to understand here. Our phone system, which was the envy of the world when it was introduced, is built on top of copper wires, that twisted pair you see in the upper left. Over the 70s, basically 80s and 90s, cable wires have come to dominate, particularly in urban areas. They can carry more data than the copper wire, but they're built to very much privilege downloading, consumption of information and entertainment over uploading, being productive, joining in a conference call, running a business from your home. Fiber on the bottom here is made of glass in that extraordinary clear core there with a little arrow. As far as we can tell, the communications carrying capacity of a fiber optic line is unlimited. Lasers push data through that very clear core for kilometers, and those lasers can be upgraded constantly without digging up the streets, and the information carrying capacity is unlimited as far as we can tell. And that's fiber optic, and that's what the rest of the world views as the common wire. Certainly in northern European countries and in Asia, fiber is the wire. As far as we know, it's future-proof for the next 40 or 50 years. It'll serve us well, and it can be, as I said, constantly upgraded. You might be saying, well, we've got lots of wires in America. What's wrong? Aren't we always the leading country here? Well, for your convenience, I've listed out who's providing high-speed internet access in America. Here's the list: AT&T, Comcast, new Charter. Charter recently merged with Time Warner Cable. These are the leading providers of wired access in America. You might say, well, looking at that, looks like we've got a richly competitive market. Well, it turns out that over the course of time, where consolidation is possible, competition is impossible, and markets have steadily been divided. So we've got these different wires: copper, fiber to the home, and the cable wire. The copper line is rapidly becoming the new dial-up. If people can leave DSL connections or afford a cable line, they will go to the cable provider in their town. And over time, we've seen that cable is grabbing almost all, or in some cases more than all, net additions of new high-speed internet access subscriptions in America. I stopped tracking this in 2013 because it no longer made sense to keep up with it, because cable is getting absolutely the lion's share of the marketplace. People are dropping telco DSL wherever they can afford to do so. This shows that same kind of information a little bit more dramatically, with AT&T DSL and Verizon DSL falling through the floor, while Comcast and Time Warner Cable, now Charter, continue to grow. Where cable is competing against Verizon's fiber product, Fios, our only national fiber provider, fiber usually wins. It's a better technology. It carries more data and symmetrically. Cable, though, in competition with all the other telco wires, wins. And if you're a big cable company, cable wins even more. And if you're a smaller telephone company, telephone companies lose even more. And the major cable players never enter their rivals' territories. Long ago, they called it the Summer of Love, divided up their systems so that one company covers Minneapolis, another covers Sacramento, as are divided markets, and what you might call bounded competition, really limited competition in America. So more on this, just some facts for those of you who love percentages. There's very little overlap between the major cable companies and any competition from fiber, and any competition actually between telcos and cable companies. Now, fiber right now is provided by one national provider, and that's Verizon, but they're steadily selling off their Fios systems. They have sold off California, Texas, and Florida to Frontier, and only in leafy suburbs of Boston, places like that, can you actually buy the Verizon Fios product. It's not available in most of the country. This is leading to a dramatic digital divide on a national level, as well as leaving a lot of Americans behind internally. When it comes to fiber connections as a percentage of our total internet access, we are at most in the middle of the pack, with Korea, Japan, and Sweden far ahead of us. And this has dramatic implications for our future as the nation from whom new innovations in services and products made possible through collaboration over fiber will emerge. We may not be that sandbox unless we fix our policy situation. At the moment, we have no national path to an upgrade to fiber. We know that there's very little competition. We know that wireless is not going to save the day. We all love our wireless devices, but they require a wire. 95% of any wireless connection is a wire, and most people who can afford it and have a smartphone also have a wire at home. We also know that people love Wi-Fi, but that requires fiber everywhere. Cities are really worrying about whether they'll be able to carry the tsunami of wireless data being produced by their smartphones. So I'm on the track of a third book. Let me take a sip as my voice cracks. This one's going to be called Fiber, and it is about this electrification story, the future America won't have. We're going through this enormous change around the world towards fiber and advanced wireless, and unless the U.S. gets its act together, we won't be leading that charge. Topics I'm covering in this book are about economic growth, new ideas and new ways of making a living that will stem from having this access everywhere in America. Also, I don't want to lose the social justice issue. Giving everybody opportunities across America depends on having fiber everywhere. Certainly for advanced healthcare, to be able to ship around all the data we'll be producing, addressing the isolation of older people, connecting rural areas to services that are cost-effective will require these connections everywhere. Education. Right now you can participate in this session through voice. We can't, over current internet access connections in America, routinely feel present in a classroom, feel that we're actually part of a learning experience through our eyes as well as our ears. It just takes too much data, and our networks are not capable of producing that for us. There are lots of classrooms, and we need to be fostering them and helping everybody have equal opportunity. Then we can get into all the fancy things coming in the future, which will be genuinely productive for people around the world, being able to augment our lived reality with data, being able to speak to anyone in real time in another language. Most fundamentally for Americans, we need new jobs. We need workforce development, and those new occupations that deploy human skills of empathy and compassion, again, will be vastly forwarded through fiber. Fiber's the first time we'll be able to have eye contact at a distance with another human being. Can't do that over existing connections, and that's a deep issue for our future. So I've been traveling. That's me looking concerned there, upper right. Here I am in Sweden, watching people show me how you can help a stroke victim rehabilitate in a very rural area through observation from a clinician at a distance. I'm a musician, so I get very interested in what's possible over fiber using instruments. Imagine being able to play with a band or string quartet in real time. Again, only possible with fiber, where you can have no latency, no delay, and very, very high resolution experiences. I'm also very interested in what city governments can do using data. Again, this is going to require fiber, otherwise it's all built on sand. Existing city halls are closed off to the public, but what if you were able to collect data from your streets and sensors and understand it and know what the city knows and be able to moderate your energy use, moderate your use of electricity, and help your city be more energy efficient. Again, Stockholm's way ahead on this, but we could be doing it too. Same thing for houses, understanding them and being able to visualize where events are happening using this connection. I wrote a second book with Steve Goldsmith about this topic, using data to be a better governing institution, and this is a very acute area where fiber access is needed. Really, you should be able to think of your city as a stack where open fiber is at the bottom, sensors, open data, screens, and algorithms are able to chew through all of this, not in a mechanical way, in a human-driven, policy-driven way. Now, for the next 4 years, we'll be seeing a lot of activity, I hope, on the fiber front. I am optimistic that lowering the cost of capital across the country through either a series of infrastructure banks, perhaps President Trump will be interested in this, or local financing options will make fiber networks more possible. I'm also optimistic that we will see this infrastructure as a holistic, essential input into everything else we want to do for energy use, water, transport, communications, healthcare, education, etc. And there is some pessimism about the role of the FCC here. The last chairman, Tom Wheeler, labeled Internet access as a utility, which is what I believe it is. And the question is whether the current new chairman, Chairman Pai, will keep that labeling in place or not. I'm delighted to answer questions about that. And I am seeing a raft of activity at the state level where states are trying to limit what cities can do to take their destinies into their own hands. You should know that there are hundreds of cities across the country who are worried about this fiber upgrade story and are trying to do this for themselves. A good place to follow this development is a site called munibroadband.org, which covers a lot of these networks. And recently, personally, I have been very active in traveling around the United States to interview people, learn about these stories. I believe that San Francisco, whose advisory panel I've just joined, is going to be the first major U.S. city to explore a holistic upgrade to open access fiber for both social justice and economic growth reasons. By open access, I merely mean that the fiber will be provided on a wholesale basis. The city won't itself be providing services, and this will engender lots of private sector competitive provision of services across a San Francisco controlled network. It's a great development because it'll mean that the leading tech city in the United States will be able to experiment using technology itself. I've been to Chattanooga already. I'll be going back. They are the leading city in the country with the fastest network, and they're first out of the gate at ensuring that fiber is available across the city. It's still too expensive for people who are poor, and so they are looking at their workforce development and trying to understand how they could extend that network to public housing and public education in a way that would be truly generative. I've recently returned from Wilson, North Carolina, a very small town which has a gigabit symmetric network that's available for $10 a month in public housing and apartment buildings, and for slightly more in other places in that town. They are also working very hard on workforce development. These are all, in a sense, scattershot developments of individual cities that are taking on this issue. My hope is that over time the mayors will get, even more mayors will become jealous, and the federal government will finally wake up and take this on as a policy issue. On Friday I returned from rural Minnesota, where 27 little towns and townships have created a cooperative that is providing or will provide gigabit connections to farms in that area and very, very small towns, keeping them, again, in the fabric of America, making it possible for young people to return to these areas to work. I had the really interesting vision of a farm. How they use fiber is remarkable. They can sense everything their hogs are up to and see all the data about what the farm is doing and how it's generating productive economic activity. It's really something. I've also been to Seoul and to Stockholm, Oslo. I'll be going to Tokyo and Singapore. 2 years ago I went to Havana, where people actually cried over the lack of internet access on that island. That's improving, but it's still a pretty desperate situation. This issue of people crying over internet access really brings home to me how vital an issue this is. This really is just like electrification. People cried again in front of me in Minnesota last week about how important this is. I want to leave you with the picture from Stockholm. This is a picture of installing fiber on the streets of this city. these Swedes are really sensible, and 20 years ago they decided that they didn't want to be under the thumb of any one incumbent. Here in Cambridge, all we can get for high-speed internet access is provided by Comcast, and it's very expensive, and there's no choice, obviously, and we were under that thumb. That's not the case in Sweden, where they created sort of a nonprofit government corporation that put in this neutral layer, they call it StoCab, wholesale fiber to every home and business. So all that StoCab sells is reasonably priced access to this unlit sort of passive infrastructure. You can think of it as a street grid, just to be non-technical here, and that again makes possible really extraordinary competition in the layers above. So the government stays out of itself providing services, and all of these other actors do that. The government doesn't compete with the retail market, but instead makes the retail market possible. That is, after all, the goal of regulation. It's to unleash human potential to make possible competitive, thriving markets. In the United States, it's very clear. Our sole reliance on high-speed internet access providers to themselves provide economic growth and social justice internet access across the United States is not working, and we need to initially at the community level and later at the federal level take this on. This is exactly akin, what's that? Okay, this is exactly akin to the electrification move. Here's a quote from Sweden, somebody saying, "I love the idea that you flip open your laptop and you pay $25 per gigabit access, and you have that operator delivering bits over this very competitive network." In the United States, it took the leadership of Roosevelt to ensure that everybody had access to electricity at a reasonable cost. We forget this, but electrification of the country was the leading domestic policy issue in the 1930s presidential campaigns. FDR took on the special interests of the private cabal of electricity operators that were by and large controlling electricity in the country in both urban and rural areas, and made them subject to regulation, ensured that access was available at a reasonable cost across the country. We need that kind of leadership today to make this upgrade, to ensure that the United States leads the world, has the rest of the world in its rearview mirror when it comes to new businesses, new opportunities, and reasons to attract people to our shores. So that's a brief summary of what I've been up to with my research and the travels I've been carrying out. We really are just at the beginning of this enormous issue for the country. I'm seeing sprinklings of activity in these many hundreds of communities across the country, but we will need to take this on nationally before too much time passes. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. We have a number of questions, Professor Crawford. Question number 1. Won't the push for 5G and small cell technologies, which are due to be certified by 2020, necessarily drive the deployment of fiber?
That's a great question. So just to explain for the rest of us, there is a dream that our existing wireless access, which goes under the nickname 4G, that's what Verizon is mostly selling us, an AT&T fourth generation of cellular data carriage, will be changed into something called 5G by about 2020, when a standard is due to be adopted internationally for carrying data over cellular networks at a very high capacity. The questioner is absolutely right that in order, so this will take about 2 seconds of technical explanation. To carry such large amounts of data, the wireless signal has to be moving very, very quickly. That is, has to be wobbling very quickly over very short periods of time. Any wireless signal that's doing that, it is able to carry a ton of data, but it also degrades very quickly over distance. This is why when you walk away from the Starbucks where you're using the Wi-Fi, within about 10 feet, you can't pick up the signal anymore. That's because that Starbucks Wi-Fi signal has only gone over a very short distance. That's going to be increasingly true for 5th generation wireless technology. So you'll have to have connections to wires in cities every 50 to 100 feet. That's called a small cell. The area that pole or tower is going to have to cover can only be very small in order for that wireless transmission to actually work and to reach you. So you'll have to have fiber feeding every single one of those small cells in order for the enormous amount of data produced by these 5G networks to be carried anywhere. So the questioner is absolutely right. It is true that deployment of this advanced wireless will require fiber and that these two developments are complementary. The problem is that what we don't want to do is reinstantiate in cities the same monopolies we currently have on the wired part of Internet access service to build those into our future for wireless. So cities need to both deploy fiber and make sure that any of these small cells that exist are available on a neutral basis to any carrier so that anybody can sell us 5G wireless access, not just AT&T or Verizon. So a bit of a long answer to the question. The answer is yes, 5G will require fiber, and cities need to control their destinies by ensuring that both the fiber and the small cells are subject to city control.
Great. The next is a two-part question. Why is Verizon selling off its fiber if that is the real way forward? And is there an incentive for cable companies to join the fiber movement and replace its cable wires with fiber?
Two great questions, both of which illustrate the stagnant markets in the United States. Let me start with the second one. Cable operators, particularly in urban areas in the United States, enjoy unparalleled pricing power. Basically, they're not subject to genuine competition unless no, I'm just going to stop there. They face very little competition. They also face very little oversight. So in a marketplace in which you have neither competition nor oversight, you have no particular incentive to upgrade to fiber. Why would you? The cable plant can be upgraded cheaply to have very high download speeds for people who are willing to pay what the cable company wants to charge for that wire. But it's not built at the moment, these cable networks, to have this idea of uploading also built in, and they have particularly no incentive to charge a reasonable price, a utility sort of price for their wire, because they've got pricing power. They really have no competition. So the answer to the second question is no, there's no particular incentive to upgrade in the absence of either competition or oversight. The answer to the first question is part of the problem. Because Verizon has a choice as a company between providing wireless services, which have higher profit margins that they can use to pass on shareholder dividends and create buyback opportunities for their shareholders on the one hand, so they could be either a wireless provider or sell wired access like Fios. They are taking the position that they are much more of they're really a wireless media distribution company. They have a few relics of the Fios service left, again in places where they have already installed it, but they announced 7 years ago that they're not going to expand that fiber wire, and they are in fact abandoning their wired services across the country, particularly in rural areas. Boy, I've heard some stories recently. If you live in a rural area served by Verizon or AT&T DSL and you sell your house, there's a high probability that that local phone company is not going to allow the buyer of your house to pick up the DSL contract, that you'll lose that DSL connection. Because they don't want to be wired companies. They feel the margins are lower there, their shareholders are happier with there being a wireless company. This is a nightmare for realtors because you somehow have to persuade the phone company, the buyer, and the seller to all cooperate. In some rural areas, the seller actually stays on the phone bill so that their buyer can continue to have high-speed internet access, which is a cataclysm. So that's the answer. They're backing off because it's better for their shareholders, which points us to the reality here, which is that this is just like electricity. This is just a utility. It is in no private company's interest to provide us with the economic growth and social justice opportunities that the entire country needs, and this upgrade is only going to come with genuine public intervention.
Thank you. Another question. Commissioner O'Reilly is on record as saying that there is no right to broadband. It is not a necessity. Water and shelter, according to O'Reilly, are necessities. What kind of broadband policies do you anticipate from this administration?
What's been so energizing, really, about visiting these cities across the United States is that no one ever mentions the Trump administration. It doesn't matter. These localities are taking matters into their own hands because, as the question anticipates, I think we'll see an FCC for the next 4 years that is basically happy to let these 4 giant companies do whatever they want to do and merge with each other. This will leave the situation we have in place as the status quo and won't lead to the upgrade that we so desperately need as a nation. So by nature, I'm a pretty calm, apolitical person, and that's why I love working with cities, because they're pretty calm and apolitical too, or I hope they are. I'm going to be focusing my personal energies on the city level for the next little while, and then hoping that we'll see a change in administration in 4 years that will allow us to view high-speed internet access as utility. Commissioner O'Reilly should go out into America and talk to people who are trying to survive without high-speed internet access. For them, it's just like water. It's just like electricity. There is absolutely no difference, and they know that they can't attract new generations to live in their cities or communities, and that without it, and that is the secret to economic survival. He should also take a hard look at economic growth in the United States. Whatever the administration is currently seeing, we know that we're not producing enough good new ideas right now in America for new ways of making a living. These symmetric, very high capacity information networks will be a huge assist in developing those new jobs for the future.
Another question. What policies did other countries adopt to promote fiber deployment that could also work for the U.S.?
Thanks for the question. Well, in other countries, this entire issue, telecommunications, information transmission, is viewed as a matter of industrial policy. Take a look at Korea, for example, struggling to come out of the rubble in just a few decades. They took the position that it was essential to have very high capacity, competitive fiber access everywhere, including in extraordinarily rural areas. So that's why South Korea heads the list. It was just industrial policy. We're going to have a wholesale network, particularly in Seoul. There's a wholesale network running through the subways that was put in there by the mayor quite a while ago, and very competitive access. Same thing in Japan. They set up 2 wholesale providers for different parts of the country so they could benchmark pricing for access to that wholesale input, so they compare one to the other and make sure that neither wholesale provider is gouging the retail guys. And as a result, very competitive, very fast service. China these days definitely sees fiber as an industrial policy issue and is rapidly connecting as many citizens as it can to fiber networks. They understand that this creates a giant middle class for China to sell its products to. Same situation in the Nordic countries, where they just saw this as part of what is basic. So it's a matter of industrial policy for these other countries. It has been left largely to the private market in Southern Europe and in the United States, which is why we are in the position we are today.
Another question. You've spoken about the national and local level. I'm wondering if you can speak a little about the state level, whether there have been some efforts to restrict or limit municipal broadband.
It's a terrific question, and thank you for touching on this very important issue. Already, 19 states in the United States make it difficult or impossible for cities to take their destinies into their own hands and call for the creation or oversee fiber networks. These bills, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, were heavily pushed by representatives of Comcast, Time Warner, Cable, AT&T, and less Verizon, but the other three certainly have been very active at the state level. This is creating a very odd situation where the state is saying basically to cities, we don't want you to be more successful than you are. We want you to stay in place and not decide anything about telecommunications policy or your citizens' access to better information assets. We need to roll those bills back. We need to return it to the power of the cities to do something about this, and we particularly need to ensure that no new state laws pass. Bills were introduced recently in both Virginia and Missouri. Bills have been introduced in Ohio and Minnesota. There's a constant sort of war going on in these areas. It's quite easy to capture credulous legislators at the state level, unfortunately, for the industry to do this. I was just in Minnesota, as I said last week, and there's a bill being pushed on in their capital that would have cities lose control over those small cells for 5G deployment, and that's being pushed by AT&T. So this is another area where we need to be sort of aware and active to ensure that we push the country along.
Great. We have time for one or two more questions.
Okay.
So send them in. We have another question for you. In order to see more widespread access, do you see any recent developments of alternatives that can infiltrate the market as a possible substitute for the wired connection that would be more affordable for poorer communities?
There really is no substitute for fiber, and people will wave their hands a lot and say, well, there's wireless. Wireless is coming, it's right around the corner. I have to say this has been a technique of the telecommunications industry for decades to say, don't tell us what to do. Something brand new is just about to show up. And that's happening today with people's talk about wireless. Look, it's short-sighted. Saying we can have wireless without this wire is like saying, oh, we've got airplanes. Who needs airports? You know, this data has to land somewhere, and it has to be connected to the rest of the internet somewhere, which is why widespread deployment of very high-capacity wires is essential. So for several reasons, no substitute is showing up and will not show up for the foreseeable future. A lot of this has to do with the laws of physics. So as I explained, wireless communication will degrade very rapidly over distance. Just can't go very far before the signal is lost if it's carrying a tremendous amount of data. That's also true because of interference. A wireless signal in the air can be blocked by big bags of water, in other words, humans. It can be blocked by trees, weather, rain, snow. All kinds of things can interfere with the ability of a wireless signal to reach its destination unimpeded. Anywhere you've got a hill or a tree or the risk of heavy weather, you would not want to rely on a wireless connection as your persistent data connection to the world. It's just not a good idea. It's not going to work in the long run. So this fiber is also using wireless signals, but those wireless signals are contained within this extraordinarily clear glass, so they're protected from the elements. The glass cable won't degrade because of water. It's actually pretty solid. Once it's there, the signals would just continue to be carried. The glass is also able to bend and able to carry signals extraordinary distances. As I said, upwards of 20 kilometers. A signal sent by a laser can pass through this extraordinarily clear glass until it's reached by it touches the electronics at the other end. So on the one hand, with fiber, you've got unlimited data carrying capacity, because the science of photonics keeps advancing. These lasers can carry more and more and more and more data, combined with a transmission medium, that's the glass, as far as we know, is not subject to the kinds of interference that wireless signals are. So that's what we've got with my future. Unlimited communications capacity, very cheap once the fiber's in the ground. You know, this is just basic infrastructure. Once we put that cost, most of which is labor, by the way, so we can put a lot of people to work. Once we put that cost in the ground, it becomes, the fiber cost itself falls through the floor year after year. It's only expensive if you try to think of fiber as paying out like some kind of media asset, so you can make your money back in 2 or 3 years. That's not the nature of infrastructure, and certainly not the nature of fiber. It is going to take 10, 12, maybe more years for this initial investment to pay back, and so your capital has to be patient. But the spillovers will be enormous. So on the one hand, that's what we've got. Fiber over here. Let's put it on your left. On the right, wireless, which is certainly cheaper to install, but relies itself on having the wire in place in the first place. Can't carry as much data, won't work in hilly rural areas or areas where you've got a lot of distance between towers, and will never approach the capacity of the fiber network. So not as good a story.
Great. We have a final few questions that have come in.
Good.
Given the apparently coordinated absence of competition among providers, have there been any antitrust challenges? And if so, what have the outcomes of those challenges been?
You know, it's surprising. There have not been any trust challenges to this. And it's hard to explain why. The FCC actually encouraged the cable operators to consolidate their systems around particular geographic area. When Adelphia, a family-owned cable company based in Philadelphia, went into bankruptcy in the early 2000s, Time Warner and Comcast were allowed by the FCC to divide up its assets and to divide them up and swap systems between themselves so that they each controlled whole of markets. So the FCC actually cooperated in helping the cable industry consolidate, did not talk about collusion. Similarly, when there was a huge swap of systems in the late 90s, early 2000s, aimed at market rationalization, you might call it from the cable operator's point of view, neither the Department of Justice nor the FCC made any noise about this. You know, this is where this subject is awkward. This really is infrastructure, and it has the characteristics of infrastructure, which include very high upfront expense, huge barriers to entry once the wire is there, and the federal government has wanted to encourage that infrastructure to be present and has fooled itself into thinking that different operators at different wires would compete with each other. So the phone company would battle it out with cable, and that would provide us with the consumer protection we needed. As it turns out, as I've described, that hasn't happened. The phone companies have backed off, by and large, leaving the wired marketplace, particularly in urban areas, to the cable companies. So no charges of collusion, a lot of market division, and a really stagnant picture for the United States as a whole at this point.
Another question. What do you think of Governor Cuomo's initiative to wire all of New York State with fiber?
Well, he actually is not talking about fiber necessarily as the modality, but it is true that Governor Cuomo put in place a $50 million broadband fund. There's a nice article in the New York Times this morning about that that's aimed at having carriers compete, enter into an auction for particular geographic areas, and the winner of that auction is the carrier that will provide service to communities at the lowest cost to the state. So it's called a reverse auction. So Cuomo is making that money available on a reverse auction basis, and that's going to help a lot of rural areas in the United States. Here's the problem. That carrier is not committing to providing fiber access, so these people may be left with very much second-class networks, and they're not promising not to hike their prices later, so that rural community may be left with a single provider who can charge whatever they want for whatever services they want to provide. So yes, it's definitely going to help, and as a state level initiative, it's brave to say you want everybody to be covered, but covered with what, at what price, actually makes a difference. And the Cuomo plan does not address those social justice concerns.
Another question for you. Who has the incentive to persuade the government to apply fiber to the country in the present except scholars? Should the government give AT&T and other companies any allowance to encourage them to launch the use of fiber?
You know, it's a great question because our current policies privilege the interests of about 4 or 5 companies over all other American companies. So, you know who has an incentive to make sure this happens? Everybody else. GE, giant companies that rely on data being available and want to be able to sell to a giant American market. You know, we potentially have 330 million Americans buying and selling in new ways across these fiber networks. Every American company should want to see that. That's where the incentive is going to come. That's where the pressure should come. It's also in our interests for every other kind of policy we want to pursue. So it isn't just scholars. It's anybody who cares about climate change. What if you want to work from home? You know, how are you going to do that without a terrific internet access connection? What if you want new industry to come to your town? How are you going to do that without a fiber network? So every other element of American society, including all the other companies, has an incentive to push this along. Now that's in the form of a monetary incentive to the other companies. I think the reason we haven't seen companies step up yet is that there's a lot of fear of incumbents out there. There really is. And there's a lot of thinking that we can kind of geek around this and avoid what is essentially a great big policy problem for the country. It's becoming increasingly obvious that that's an untenable point of view. People also care about our national security, should care about this, because the absence of resilient, terrific, redundant networks in the United States makes us less secure. So my answer is everybody has an incentive to switch this situation. The problem is it's not visible enough as a policy problem. Not enough people understand it. And so that's why I'm hoping that mayors who are becoming, well-versed in this will become actors explaining the situation to both companies and citizens and pushing the issue along on the national stage. Similar thing happened with electrification. It took a while, but we got there eventually as a country.
We have so many questions and not enough time.
Good.
We have a question about, can you explain why Google dropped fiber?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I just wrote a column about this, not to blow my own horn too much, but I make no money from anybody, by the way. I'm very careful not to have any clients or consulting arrangements, but I do write a column for Back Channel. Google Fiber backed off for the same reasons that AT&T and Verizon have backed off largely from fiber, because they're looking for very fast returns on investment. And this is not that kind of thing. It takes a while for your money to pay off. They cannot, at this point, reduce the cost of labor to put in these fiber networks, and labor is 80% of the cost of installing this. And so Google's shareholders and its leadership became impatient with the slow payoff for fiber. This is a beautiful illustration of my basic point, that it is in no private company's interest to provide us with these social justice and economic growth outcomes that the country needs to see. They want to focus on areas where they can make a quick return on their investment that will make their shareholders happy. This investment will pay off until the sun explodes. It's like a gravel pit. It just pays off at a lower rate of interest. And that kind of patient investment is one that really only comes with government involvement.
And our final question, what is being done to convince President Trump to force competition among carriers?
Well, in the context of the infrastructure discussions going on right now, in fact today the House held a hearing on infrastructure, there's a good deal of discussion of the need for better high-speed, high-capacity internet access for the country. So I'd say that right now that's the avenue to try to insert into his genuine enthusiasm for infrastructure some appreciation of the dramatic shortfalls the United States is experiencing at the moment. I don't know how successful those entreaties are going to be. It would require overriding the interests of these few companies, AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, and Time Warner, in order to change the picture. And I don't know what his appetite is to do that.
Thanks again to Professor Crawford and to you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed today's session as much as I did. If you'd like to review any part of today's webinar, the recording of this program will be available online next week. This concludes our first HLeX doubleheader this month. I hope you will join us next week, Thursday, March 30th, as we are joined by Professor Debbie Anker and Sabi Ardalan from the Harvard Immigration and Refugee Clinic for a talk entitled Executive Orders and Immigration Advocacy in the Trump Era. As a reminder, you can access today's recording or register for future lectures on our website, alumni.law.harvard.edu/HLeX. And be sure to fill out the short survey we will email you about today's event to give us feedback and help shape future programs. Again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.